So Al-Kindi is living in the 9th century, or the 3rd century of the Islamic calendar. And he's important and is, as you said, considered the father of philosophy in Islam because he's really the first person to be doing philosophy in Arabic in a way that's based on these Greek works. So if you think of philosophy in the Islamic world as falsafah, i.e. this thing that's derived from the Greeks, he's the first person who's doing that.
The way the story of philosophy has been presented is that it started with the ancient Greeks, and then it skips to the Renaissance, followed by the Enlightenment, and then all the way to today. Peter Adamson, Professor of Philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, is keen to tell us what happened in the 2,000-year gap between those famous Greeks, Socrates or Plato or Aristotle, and Thomas Aquinas, described as a founding figure of modern thought. Professor Adamson has hosted a podcast since 2010 called The History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. He's also a specialist on the Muslim philosopher Al-Kindi.
So he writes on all the different areas of philosophy, metaphysics, the soul, science, all the rest of it. But he also writes on things like how to make perfume, how to make swords, how to get stains out of clothing. So Aristotle has a theory of God, Plato has a theory of God, the Neoplatonists have a theory of God. So that they're using philosophical theology to address debates that were going on in Islamic theology. You can also use Islamic theology to kind of interpret what's going on in the Greek texts.
What was the impact of this sort of Arabic wave of translation?
So, for example, in medicine, you have someone like Al-Razi, who lived in the 9th to the 10th century, who writes a lot about Galenic medicine, but also made his own observations. Or famously, there's a lot of advances in the mathematical sciences. So, our word algebra comes from Arabic, as you can see from the al at the beginning. You have people like Ibn al-Haytham who make big advances in theories of optics. And of course, Ibn Sina would be another example.
Welcome to Muslim Footprints, a deep dive into Muslim civilizations through the ages, accompanied by some of the best experts in their field. This episode is about Al-Kindi, the father of Arab philosophy.
Abu Yusuf Yaqub ibn Ishaq Al-Kindi was the first self-identified philosopher in the Arabic tradition. So he's known as the father of Islamic philosophy. What does that mean?
That's a good question. Behind your question is kind of the question, what is philosophy? One way to think about it in this context would be to focus on an Arabic word, which is the word falsafah. And you can actually hear in the word that it's taken from the Greek word philosophia, just like the English word philosophy, right? So it's something that it's a concept that's been imported from Greek culture, from the culture of ancient Greece. And what they would mean by that certainly includes what we think of as philosophy. So thinking about knowledge or the nature of reality, the soul, proving the existence of God. These would be things that you do in philosophy, but it would also be a little bit broader. So it would include maybe things like mathematics, for example. It would at least be related to things like astronomy and astrology, actually, something Al-Kindi was interested in. It would be related to medicine. They wouldn't necessarily say that medicine is like a branch or type of falsafah, philosophy, but they would at least think it was closely associated, because just as in philosophy, you're taking from a Greek author, especially Aristotle, but also other Greek philosophers. In medicine, you're drawing on doctors who wrote in Greek, especially Galen, who lived in the 2nd century. So Al-Kindi is living in the 9th century, or the 3rd century of the Islamic calendar. And he's important and is, as you said, considered the father of philosophy in Islam because he's really the first person to be doing philosophy in Arabic in a way that's based on these Greek works.
Philosophies are kind of worldviews. Was there only one Islamic philosophy at the time?
That's a controversial question, actually. So since you're interviewing me, I'll tell you my opinion. So my opinion is no. There's really two. So the first thing is what I was just describing, which is falsafah. So again, they're thinking falsafah comes from the Greeks. At least in these early generations, they would really feel that right? But in addition, there's something else going on, which we usually call theology. And this is in Arabic kalam, or ilm al-kalam. So kalam means literally word. Ilm al-kalam means science of the word. They actually, in the medieval or classical period, they weren't exactly clear on why this was called kalam themselves. So you can find texts where they're like, why is this called kalam? So, and they had different ideas. So one idea was that it was called kalam because it was the study of the word of God. Another idea is that it was called kalam because it was about arguing or having discourse about Islam. But anyway, it was called kalam. And a lot of the time you see a kind of contrast being drawn between theology, that's kalam, and philosophy, which is falsafah, right? But actually in kalam, you see a lot of issues being raised that we would consider to be philosophical issues. So, for example, unsurprisingly, they talk about proving the existence of God, and they talk about the nature of God, right? And you might think, well, that's sort of rational theology. And in fact, people sometimes translate kalam as rational theology. But they also do things like talking about the nature of bodies, and that bodies ultimately consist of indivisible parts or atoms to which various properties are associated. They talk about free will. They talk about the conditions of moral responsibility, like what has to be true of me in order for me to be blameworthy for what I do. Of course, those two things are connected. So some of the theologians, or mutakallimun, said that God has to allow us to be free if we're morally responsible for what we do. Others denied that. So they're talking about a lot of philosophical issues in kalam. And I always say that if it wasn't for the Greek-Arabic translation movement, which produced this tradition of falsafa, we would just think of kalam as Islamic philosophy, actually. But in fact, the way things went is that there are these two mostly independent traditions. At least at first they're independent of each other. There's one that's based on the Greek sources, that's falsafa, and there's another which is kind of an indigenous development within Islam, which is kalam. And the two things are kind of developing alongside one another. There's some sniping back and forth where they're criticizing each other. There's also some attempts to use falsafa to answer questions that were being raised in kalam. So you see Al-Kindi doing that, for example. And eventually what happens is that the two things kind of merge together, but that doesn't happen until several centuries later.
And these are in different places?
No, they're absolutely in the same place. So we're mostly talking about Iraq here. So we're in the middle of the Abbasid Empire, right? We're in their new capital, Baghdad. And Al-Kindi would have been in Iraq, so his father was actually the governor of Kufa, the city in Iraq. He would have been in Baghdad, and then maybe also at Samarra, which is another city to which the Abbasids moved their capital during Kindi's lifetime. He was connected to the caliphal court. He was quite highly placed. And there's also a lot of kalam being done in Iraq, so we're really in the same geographical area. These people would have known each other, actually.
Okay. So Al-Kindi was the first, and he was around during the 800s.
Yeah, he died. We know that he died in the early 870s. We don't have an exact death date for him, but sometime after 870, yeah.
And so Baghdad was the seat of the Abbasid Caliphate. And it happened to be also the biggest city in the world and considered to be the richest.
I mean, it was certainly very big. I don't know for sure that there's no city in China that's bigger. I mean, we have to go ask historians who keep statistics about this kind of thing, but it was huge, and it was definitely bigger than any city in Europe at the time. And it's a real kind of gathering point for people from all over the Muslim empire. So obviously Islam has spread very, very quickly from the early days, like all the way from what we now call Spain, all the way to Central Asia, right? And that's happened within just a few generations. Really remarkable historical event. They've taken a lot of the territory that had belonged to the Byzantine Empire in what we now call the Middle East, and they've also encroached on the Persian areas, and they've kind of gotten all the way over to the edges of India and China. So Islam has frontiers with Christian Europe, like Latin using Christian Europe, or what we may call Western Europe, with Byzantium, and then with various peoples in Central Asia and India and China, right? So it's a huge, huge empire. And people from all over are coming to Baghdad, especially from the Middle East, because it's this massive urban population. Something else to bear in mind here is that even though Islam has been spread across that entire territory, it's not like everyone just immediately becomes a Muslim, right? So actually, if you think about a place like Syria, which is where a lot of the scholars came from who actually translated Greek philosophy and science into Arabic, in Syria, the population remains majority Christian for centuries after the arrival of Islam. So often, actually, what you want to think about here is that you've got Muslim political authorities ruling over a mixed population of Muslims, Christians, Jews, and maybe other things too, like Zoroastrians or whatever. But philosophy actually is pretty strongly associated with Christianity at this point, because it was Christians who translated it. A lot of the time, it's Christians who are writing about philosophy. Al-Kindi obviously is a Muslim, but a lot of his colleagues would have been Christians.
The Abbasid Caliphate was very rich, and it was spending a lot on translating knowledge, Greek knowledge, into Arabic. What was it that made them so committed to this knowledge culture?
So, I mean, what was going on intellectually under the Umayyads, you already have like the beginnings of reflections on Islamic theology and so on. But in terms of an attempt to take over and translate science from other cultures, including philosophy, that's really a phenomenon of the Abbasid period. It's not even only Greek culture, by the way, it's also older Iranian texts and Indian texts. So for example, they know something about Indian astronomy in the Abbasid period. But it's certainly in philosophy, the most exciting part is what they're getting from the Greeks. And there are various ideas about why they did this. So I always point out first when talking about this that a lot of the motivation would have been very practical. If you're, for example, thinking about medicine or mathematics, like you want to, get the taxes right or measure the fields or whatever, then things like geometry and arithmetic and so on are useful. Another thing that they're very interested in is astronomy and astrology. If you believe that astrology works, what could be more useful, right? You can literally know the future, right? So that's the first thing we need to bear in mind. Engineering, medicine, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, a lot of what they're doing in terms of the translation movement has immediate practical application. Even an area like logic, which they translate a lot, might be interesting to them for practical reasons, because they might have thought that it's useful to have access to high-level reflection on the nature of argument and rules of argument in order to engage in religious debate, both within Islam and across boundaries between Muslims and other faiths, right? Because as I said, remember, we're living in a very multi-faith context here. So philosophy is immediately being used by Christians and Muslims to argue against each other and also within their communities. So you have like different theological schools within Christianity using philosophy to argue over the incarnation of the Trinity or whatever. Okay, so that's one reason. It's kind of practical reason. Another reason is, maybe this is kind of an obvious reason, but still worth emphasizing. They thought that they could use philosophy to establish and maybe even to better understand the truths of Islam. So you see this in Al-Kindi, for example. He uses philosophy to demonstrate that God exists by showing that there is a principle of unity, which is perfectly one, which gives unity to all other things. And this is a kind of nice agreement, in his opinion, between something you find in Greek philosophy and something you find in Islam. So you have this Islamic idea of tawhid, which means unity, the oneness of God. And then he looks in these Greek sources and he thinks, here are arguments for proving that there's a source of unity, a purely one first principle that gives unity to everything else. And that's really the idea at the center of one of his most important works, which is called Falsafah al-Ula, so on first philosophy. And notice that it has that word falsafah in the title, right? So it's very explicitly using Greek ideas to prove something about Islam. And then maybe one other idea worth bringing in about the translation movement is that the immediate neighbors of the Abbasids include the Byzantines. So this is basically the eastern Greek-speaking part of the Roman Empire that never fell. People always think the Roman Empire ends in late antiquity because Rome falls, right? But actually, from the point of view of the Eastern Empire, Rome never fell. The Byzantines called themselves Romans. Even the Arabs called them the Rum.
Yeah.
So that's just the Roman Empire in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was always Greek-speaking. And one idea that's been put forward by a scholar named Dimitri Gutas is that the Abbasids were engaging in cultural competition with the Byzantines and effectively saying, look, we understand Greek philosophy even better than the Greeks do, i.e. better than the Greek Christians. So I think that it was a combination of various motivations that led them to do this.
And I also understood that it was because they had come into this kind of Persian culture that was very committed to knowledge. Was that also the case?
Yeah, actually that's something else that Gutas talks about. So another hypothesis that he explores is that just as there's competition with Greek Christian culture, there's also appropriation of and competition with Persian culture. Here might be worth remembering what's happened historically. So the Umayyad Caliphate is based a little bit further west than the Abbasid Caliphate. And the Abbasids really come in from a power base in Central Asia and Persia and displace the Umayyads. They actually chase the Umayyads further west, and you wind up with a kind of rump caliphate of Umayyad power in Spain. But now the Islamic heartlands are dominated by an Abbasid political force, which to some extent is related to Persian culture. And because of the importance of Persia in this historical period, you get all kinds of reflections about things like which is better, the Persian language or the Arabic language, who has the better poetry, that kind of thing, right? And so it's pretty believable that because there had already been this long-standing tradition of Persian literature and religions, Zoroastrianism, for example, it may well be that the Abbasids were trying to create a kind of intellectual, scholarly structure of their own that could kind of replace that or maybe move beyond it. So that might be another political and ideological motivation for the translation movement.
In any case, they were very well paid. There's this number bandied around that I hear a lot. 500 gold dinars a month.
Yeah, which sounds pretty good, right?
$24,000 a month.
Right. So it was a lot of money, for sure, definitely. They were very well paid. And it's extremely advanced work, right? Because you need to know ancient Greek, you need to know Arabic, or you might actually translate from ancient Greek into Syriac, which is another Semitic language. Again, a lot of these translators, almost all the translators, in fact, were Christians. And they're coming out of a continuous intellectual tradition in Syria and in the Syriac language, which is kind of the glue that connects late ancient philosophy to philosophy in Arabic. So there's philosophy in Greek going on in, for example, in Alexandria in Egypt, down to the 6th century. And then you have philosophy being done in Syrian monasteries for the next several centuries. And then the Arabic tradition kind of follows along from that. So it's not like the Arabs came along and revived a philosophical tradition that had just vanished for 300 years or something. It's rather that they continued something that was already going on amongst Christians, but they ramped it up and put a lot of money into it and brought it from Syriac into Arabic.
And why did the Abbasid rulers decide they needed Greek knowledge in particular? It's like 1,000 years old.
So the setting in which we need to understand late ancient philosophy is really Eastern Christianity. And we have all these communities of Christians who are doing Aristotelian logic, at least, if not the whole range of philosophical sciences. And so that kind of gives a precedent and a context for what the Abbasids are doing. So the Abbasids kind of look around like, okay, what is science and philosophy in our era? Well, it's apparently this Greek stuff that the Assyrians are doing. So let's plow some money into that and do it really in style. And that's their innovation, is to pump a lot of money into it as a project, hire a bunch of Christians to translate everything they can find. And they literally like go around trying to track down manuscripts. They will find multiple manuscripts for the same work in order to get the best version, which is free from errors, and so on and so forth. So it was a really major undertaking.
But it's very much like organic and a sense of continuity.
Yes, absolutely.
Using what was going on in the natural in the surroundings that they were in.
I mean, the Abbasids, of course, have a kind of self-presentation where they act as if and they talk as if they've saved something or revived something that's been completely lost or destroyed. Like they're reaching back into the mists of time and preserving this long dead wisdom that goes back to antiquity, right? And I mean, that's not entirely wrong in the sense that they do facilitate the study, for example, of works of Aristotle that had not been studied since, let's say, the 5th, 6th century in Greek. But it's not like nothing was going on. There was a context for it.
So let's introduce the translation movement. There were basically two main translation movements. One was medicine and one was philosophy. And Al-Kindi was head of the philosophy one. And then you had somebody else, Hunayn ibn Ishaq, who was head of the one for medicine. Is that kind of how it works?
Yeah, I mean, usually people talk about the whole thing as the translation movement, and then there are circles of translators who work within this broader movement. And the two main ones are indeed the Kindi circle and the Hunayn circle. So Kindi, we've already talked about a bit, so his circle is mostly Christians, actually, so he's Muslim, but the translators are Christians, for reasons we've already gone into. And they are indeed focused on philosophy mostly, but philosophy in this broad sense that includes things like mathematics, engineering, geography, and so on, or even the study of things like meteorology, because there's work by Aristotle about meteorology, cosmology, astronomy. So all of these things are associated with philosophy in their minds. And Aristotle wrote about some of them, right? So Aristotle writes about physics, he writes about cosmology, and so on. And for them, there's not that big a distance between thinking about Aristotle and thinking about, for example, Ptolemy, who is a 2nd century astronomer and astrologer. He's their main Greek source for the science of the stars. Actually, an interesting fact about this is that in Arabic, there's a phrase, ilm al-nujum, which means the science of the stars. And that can be used to refer to either astrology or astronomy. So those two things are very closely connected for them. And then all of that is very closely connected to, for example, Aristotelian cosmology. So by cosmology, I mean the study of what the universe is, how it's arranged, and so on. What is it made of, right? So he's really interested in mathematics. As far as we can tell, they usually translate directly from Greek, actually, not from Syriac. And then the Hunayn circle, they translate mostly from Greek into Syriac, and then they will also sometimes translate from Syriac into Arabic. If you think about that, like Syriac is also a Semitic language, like Arabic. So translating Syriac into Arabic is maybe like translating Portuguese into Italian, whereas translating from Greek into a Semitic language is really hard because it's two different language families, right? So the tricky thing is getting it into a Semitic language in the first place. And Hunayn does that with medical works, so especially Galen. He actually wrote a kind of report about his own translation activities, and he even talks about things like tracking down multiple manuscripts of the same work. The reason you would want to do that, because that sounds kind of weird, like why would you want more than one copy of the same thing before translating it? And the answer is, imagine that you've got a book that's maybe 100 pages long and you copy it out by hand. think about how many mistakes you would make. Even if you're a professional scribe, you'll make mistakes. So just as today, when we try to establish the text for an ancient Greek work, we take all the manuscript evidence we can get our hands on, and then we sort of compare it. And he was already doing the same thing in the 9th century. So he's a real hyper specialist on medicine. He also wrote works of his own on medicine. But it should be said that there were other members of his circle that had non-medical interest, and in particular his son, who's confusingly named Ishaq ibn Hunayn. So the father is Hunayn ibn Ishaq, the son is Ishaq ibn Hunayn. Ibn means son of, right? So that kind of makes sense, that he would be Ishaq ibn Hunayn, right? He's a specialist in philosophy, and in fact he did a lot of translations of Aristotle, which become the standard translations that are used by later thinkers because they were so good.
And let's just say that Galen was the most powerful figure of Greek medicine.
Yeah, basically you've got Aristotle as the main figure for philosophy and Galen as the main figure for medicine.
And this Hunayn ibn Ishaq was an Nestorian Christian. So where were these debates kind of happening, where you had like Christians and Muslims uniting against Greeks in terms of defending their perspectives? Mm-hmm. I suppose they believed in a god.
Yeah, I mean, of course, they're all monotheists, right? There's also Jews, who we shouldn't forget, right. So they're also involved in a lot of these debates. The Christian situation is complicated because there are West Syrian and East Syrian Christians who differ in their views on theology, especially about the incarnation, the nature of Christ. They differ with each other, and they also disagree with the Byzantines, who have another theology again. So the Christians, when they're talking about religion, they will spend some of their time arguing with other Christians, and then of course they'll kind of present a united front against the Muslims as well. There's also internal debates in Islam, different kinds of different convictions and opinions about how to understand the Islamic revelation, but they'll present a united front against the Christians, right? So you have debates going on both within and across confessional lines. A really wonderful example is that at one point you have the Assyrian patriarch named Timothy had a debate with the Caliph, the Abbasid Caliph, about the relative merits of Christianity and Islam, and we have a report of that was written down in Syriac by the Christian side. Very polite debate, as you would be well advised to conduct when you were arguing with the Caliph, right? But that's a good, that's a spectacular example, but it's pretty clear that there were public debates going on quite often, and a lot of the works that we have from the period are of an apologetic character. In other words, it's a Muslim saying, here's the arguments you can use to refute the Christians, or you have Christians writing texts about how to refute the Muslims.
Now, by translation, we don't mean kind of plugging something into like Google Translate and coming out with the answer.
Yeah, right.
It sounded like they used the knowledge and they made it their own. So is translation even the right word? Is it more like influence?
Yeah, that's a great question. So actually in the medieval period itself, there were comments about the different styles of translation that had been used in the period. And something that's often associated with the Kindi circle is that they do one of two things, both of which were criticized by the people using the translations. So one thing they would do is produce translations that are extremely literal, so almost to the point where you need to have the Greek to understand what's going on in the Arabic, like almost like a word-for-word translation, right? And people thought that was too awkward and hard to read and just hard to understand. Something else they do, though, in the Kindi circle, paradoxically, is they produce these, what I would call paraphrastic translations. In other words, they take the core text, they do translate it, but they might put in whole paragraphs of new ideas, or they might translate it in a way that the Greek text is already being rendered into Arabic in such a way as to make it somehow seem more relevant or applicable to Islamic concerns. So, for example, there's a text by Plotinus, the founder of Neoplatonism, who lived in the 3rd century, that was translated into Arabic in the Kindi circle, and the version we have takes immense liberties with Plotinus, to the point where my first book was about the differences between the Arabic Plotinus and Plotinus in Greek. So there's lots of philosophical changes that happen there. But then on the other hand, we have translations that were really good translations, kind of against the standards we would now use. So for example, the translations of Aristotle done by Hunayn's son, Ishaq ibn Hunayn, they're really good, and they are accurate, they're relatively readable. I think part of what happened here is they just needed a generation or two to find the kind of grammatical structures and also the vocabulary to render Greek philosophy really accurately and readably into Arabic. So it took a while, but they got there in the end.
Let's talk about some of the features of this activity. What was Al-Kindi's mandate? Like, was it to bring Greek knowledge to Muslims? Like I saw in one of your writings, or I think it was you, his own writings, so Al-Kindi's writings, might be thought of as a sustained public relations campaign intended to display and advertise the value of Greek thought for a contemporary 9th century Muslim audience. What was he trying to achieve?
Yeah, so maybe there's, to some extent, a distance between what his patrons wanted and what he wanted, or there's a conversation going on between them, and you can sometimes see that in the way he talks to the patrons at the beginnings of his treatises. So remember, he's not a translator. He's sort of coordinating the work of a bunch of translators. As I said, he corrected the translations, whatever that means, and also he probably was involved in choosing which texts to translate, right? So you have these patrons saying, bring us the fruits of Greek science, and then he's selecting what that would mean. Maybe they even started out with much more pragmatic concerns, like, can you please tell us about engineering and medicine? And he's like, well, wouldn't you like to hear about metaphysics as well, though? That's really interesting. And I'll show you why it's interesting by using Greek metaphysics to prove that the Islamic God exists and is real, right? So that our conception of God is the right one. So it's not quite clear how big a gap there may have been between their initial expectation and his idea of what he could deliver.
Or what he wanted to deliver.
Yeah, for sure. And for sure what he wanted to do along the way was convince as many rich, powerful people as possible that it was a good idea to keep investing money in the translation movement. Because as you said, it's very expensive, right? So that's why I say it's a public relations exercise to some extent. Something else that maybe we haven't captured yet is the astounding breadth of Al-Kindi's project and the number of different topics he writes on. So he writes on all the different areas of philosophy, metaphysics, the soul, science, all the rest of it. But he also writes on things like how to make perfume, how to make swords, how to get stains out of clothing. And this is all somehow based on some kind of background assumptions that he's taking from Greek science, right? So, for example, his conception of astrology, or, because he writes on astrology too, his conception of how the stars move, how they affect the lower realm in which we live, that's all based on Ptolemy and other Greek science. Or even something like how to make swords, very practical topic. But at least in the back of his mind, he'd have like ideas taken from Aristotle about how metal works and how it's made of the 4 elements and so on.
And the astrology thing, he thought, everything was connected, right?
Yeah, right. So he actually has a treatise about, this is kind of unusual for him. He does sometimes allude to the Quran. And then there's this one treatise in particular, which is in its entirety a commentary on one line from the Quran, in which it says that the stars and the trees bow down before God or prostrate themselves before God. And he often does this at the beginning. He says to the patron to whom it's addressed, you asked me to write about this. And then one could doubt that, right? When probably he wanted to write about it. And he's like, well, I'm writing this for you, right? So you wanted me to write about this. And what he says is that God's providential command for the universe is passed through the stars, and God uses the stars as a kind of instrument for making things happen down here on earth, right? So in a way, our relationship to God is mediated through the motions of the stars. And then Al-Kindi would think that when the stars are moving above us, it affects the physical events down here by, for example, manipulating how hot or cold or wet or dry the environment is, and that would make various things happen through a very complicated physical set of interactions, right? So you can use astrology to study, for example, whether it's a good idea to go on a journey, or he has a treatise on how to find buried treasure using astrology, which I've always thought we should invest more money in understanding that treatise, because it would be, we could make a profit. So he has a lot of ideas about how you could use science to actually kind of support the practical activities at the caliphal court. Right? So even think about something like, making perfume, making swords, right? This is a very sort of elite, aristocratic set of topics, and it's a very elite world in which he's moving.
Was his goal also to help people understand Islam, or was that just the Kalam movement?
No, I think it's definitely his goal. And in fact, in a way, it connects to the point about public relations. So he's sort of looking at what the theologians, at least I think he was, looking at what the theologians are doing, thinking about the debates they were having, and then trying to understand how Greek philosophy could be used to answer those questions or to settle those debates. So a good example is that there was a lot of debate in the 9th century about how God's attributes, so for example, you say that God is wise, how does God's wisdom relate to God? And one of the concerns that they had was that if God is, for example, powerful and wise and good, then you've got God, and then you've got his wisdom, his power, and his goodness. So now it sounds like you've got 4 things instead of just God, one thing. And so some theologians thought that you had to interpret statements like God is wise or God is powerful in a kind of special way. So, for example, if I say that you're wise, we might say, well, okay, there's you and there's your wisdom, right? So these are 2 different things, but in God's case, somehow they're the same. So some of the Mutakalimun, the theologians of the time, will say God is wise through a wisdom which is not different from God, right? And then if you look at what Al-Kindi does in his metaphysics, so he's talking about God as the pure, true one, the source of unity for all things. And then he says that this rules out the possibility of having multiple attributes that are distinct from God and truly predicated of him. So I think that that clearly shows that he was using Greek ideas, in this case Greek metaphysics and logic. He's using those ideas to address a concern that was current in theology of the time. And in a way, I think what his idea was, oh, you theologians are all kind of thrashing around trying to figure this out. If you just had this more powerful intellectual equipment that we get from the Greeks, you could sort this out, no problem, and here's how you do it.
Yes, and that was my next point, like how they made Greek philosophy palatable for their audience. So somebody said to me, they were like, oh, well, weren't they just trying to squeeze God into the Greek philosophy? And so they have found that problematic. But to me, it sounds like they were just using that influence.
Well, I think that the mistake behind the worry is that it sounds like the person you're talking to doesn't realize how much God there already is in Greek philosophy. So Aristotle has a theory of God, Plato has a theory of God, the Neoplatonists have a theory of God. And so squeezing God into Greek philosophy would be like squeezing worries about money into Marxism. I mean, it was one of the main things that they're concerned with, right? So it's not that they're importing theological concerns into an intellectual tradition where there was no theology. It's rather that they're using philosophical theology, which they find in Aristotle, Plato, Neoplatonists, using that to address debates that were going on in Islamic theology. So it's more like you've got 2 theologies, which are competing, potentially complementary. Maybe you can use one to sort out what's going on in the other. You can also use Islamic theology to kind of interpret what's going on in the Greek texts, which is what the Kindi circle does. So for example, in the Arabic version of Plotinus, they use the word sifat, which means attributes, which is not really corresponding to anything in Plotinus, but shows that they're understanding Plotinus through the filter of this Islamic theological debate about attributes.
So Al-Kindi kicked off Islamic philosophy. How did it evolve after him?
Okay, not a small question, obviously. So, but let's take
60
just
seconds.
let's just take the next few centuries. Okay?
Yeah.
So there's the key figure for the Islamic philosophical tradition is without doubt Ibn Sina, who's often called Avicenna because that was his name in Latin. So he dies in 1037 CE. So that means he's almost 200 years after Kindi. And in the meantime, what's happened is that there's been a kind of expansion and completion of the translation movement, so that by the middle of the 10th century, they can pretty much read all the Aristotle we can read, because they really go hard into the Aristotle. They know a lot less about Plato, but they have at least translations of summaries of Platonic dialogues, and they have other Greek sources like the Neoplatonists that we were talking about, Ptolemy, Galen, right? So by the 10th century...
Tell us quickly why they know less Plato than they do Aristotle.
Yeah, that's tricky. So...
I thought it was really simple. I thought it was that Aristotle was like the BA and Plato was like the PhD.
Yeah, I say that sometimes.
Yeah.
So I think there's several factors, actually. One is that there might just have been more manuscripts floating around for Aristotle than Plato, because the Syrian tradition was more focused on Aristotle. Another reason would be what you just said. So Aristotle was conceived of as kind of introductory level. Plato is advanced. Of course, that could go together with the fact that there might be more manuscripts and commentaries for Aristotle. So that's for students. So you have lots of books, right? But then another thing is that Plato might have been perceived as literature as much as philosophy, or more so even, right? Because his works are very literary. They're also not helpfully labeled as things like metaphysics, physics, logic, the way Aristotle's works are. So if you're trying to develop a philosophical curriculum and someone hands you like Plato's Republic, it's like, what is this, man? I mean, is this about the soul? Is this political? What am I doing here? It's way too long. It's way too complicated. Just tell me what I need to know, right? And if you want that, then Aristotle's better than Plato. So I think all of that, maybe combined with the intrinsic difficulty of translating Plato, would explain why they have more Aristotle than Plato.
Okay. Anyway, now continue. Go back to how it
it
evolved.
So someone
Avicenna.
like Al-Farabi, who's working in the 10th century, has a very wide understanding of Greek philosophy, and he's writing about logic. He's writing about political philosophy. Even he's writing about every area of philosophy, pretty much. And there's different ways of adopting Greek philosophy in the 10th century with various kinds of emphasis. So, for example, some figures are more interested in making philosophy applicable to either Christian theology or Islamic theology. Some aren't, like Farabi's not particularly interested in that. So there's kind of a variety of ways of using Greek ideas in the 10th century, and it's a very diverse period, that century. And then Avicenna happens, right? Or Ibn Sina, let's call him Ibn Sina because that's his real name. So he comes along in the late 10th to the early 11th century. Like I said, he died in 1037. And the reason he's important is that he's self-consciously very original, while also integrating his ideas a lot with the Greek tradition. So he's reacting to this whole complicated picture of Greek into Arabic philosophy that's happened in the previous 200 years. And he's saying, okay, here's what I like, here's what I don't like. He likes Farabi, he doesn't particularly like Kindi. And one thing he likes about Farabi is that it's a very rationalist project, which is not particularly indebted to worries about like Islamic theology, right? And then he develops lots of new ideas in pretty much every area of philosophy, logic, physics, the soul, metaphysics. He's an extremely powerful, innovative philosopher. He's probably one of the top 5 philosophers who's ever lived, actually. And just in terms of his power, historical influence, and innovativeness, he's a huge figure. He's sort of like Kant, right? He's the Kant of the Islamic world, as I sometimes say. And after he comes along, everyone else is like, whoa, we need to deal with this. That was a lot.
Which country was he in?
He's from, people often say he's Persian, right? Which is true depending on what your definition of Persia is. He came from modern day Afghanistan, and then he moved around a lot, including further west. So he's kind of moving around in Central Asia, and he would have been a native Persian speaker, that's true, but most of his works are written in Arabic. We do have one work by him on philosophy that's in Persian, though. So he's this massively impactful figure, and after he comes along, to some extent he replaces Aristotle as the key philosophical authority or figure who you have to deal with. So if you look at someone like Al-Ghazali, who helpfully died in 1111, he writes a work called Incoherence of the Philosophers, which is not an attack on Aristotle, it's an attack on Ibn Sina, because he thinks of Ibn Sina as the kind of representative of what Falsafah is. The work in Arabic is called Tahafut al-Falasifa. So we have this word Falsafah, which originally meant Greek science that's been brought into Arabic, but now it's come to mean the ideas of Ibn Sina, and Ghazali takes that as his target and criticizes it, and he sort of says what he wants to keep and what he doesn't want to keep from the Avicennan system. And that sets the tone for what happens later. So then you have centuries and centuries of people reflecting on the achievement of Ibn Sina, saying what they agree with, what they don't agree with, taking his ideas further, challenging them, using them to sort out issues in everything from Islamic jurisprudence to theories of language to theology. So he becomes this massive kind of center point for the subsequent intellectual tradition.
And it ends?
No, it doesn't. To this day in Iran, there are still people working in that tradition. So, I mean, this is obviously a very long story because we're talking about more than 1,000 years, but there's a kind of widespread myth about philosophy in the Islamic world, which is that it kind of tails off in the 12th century or something. Often people think, well, there were the Greeks, and then there were the Muslims, and then Latin philosophy comes along, people like Aquinas, right? But actually, what really happens is that instead of having Aristotle-based philosophy in the Islamic world, you have Ibn Sina-based philosophy, and that just goes and goes and goes. So it goes 12th, 13th, 14th, 15th century, right up into modern Persia, the Ottoman Empire. They're all thinking about Ibn Sina, or if not Ibn Sina directly, then later thinkers who were reacting to Ibn Sina. So that kind of proliferates and goes throughout the entire Islamic world. And that really goes on until, I mean, if you wanted to say there's an ending, maybe you could say like the period of colonialism, like the 18th and 19th century. That's a real kind of break. But actually, Islamic intellectual history and the history of philosophy is extremely continuous, well beyond the 12th century into maybe the 17th, 18th centuries.
What was the impact of this sort of Arabic wave of translation? So some of the things innovations that came into math and medicine and this whole research culture.
One thing that we really should emphasize is that the fact that it's based on Greek doesn't mean that it's not innovative or like creative. So for example, in medicine, you have someone like Arazi, who lived in the 9th to the 10th century, who writes a lot about Galenic medicine, but also made his own observations. He actually worked in a hospital, or in more than one hospital. So he makes his own observations about medicine and says, well, this drug that's recommended in the ancients doesn't work, but I tried this other thing and it did work. Or he challenges Galen on a whole wide range of points. So one nice example is that Galen says when you're doing diagnosis, you should take the patient's pulse and then try to figure out which of many types of pulse it corresponds to. And he gives metaphors for them, like the rabbit kind of pulse, for example. And Razi is talking about this and he says, well, I don't know what Galen's on about here. Like, I can't tell the difference. And he's sort of sarcastic about it. He says, like, only a divine person could tell the difference between these different kinds of pulses, and maybe Galen could, but I can't. So this is useless, right? So he's often, even though he respects Galen a lot, he's often kind of sarcastic about it and says, like, this doesn't work. I did something else that did work. So he's innovating within the kind of framework of Galen's medicine. Or famously, there's a lot of advances in the mathematical sciences. So, I mean, our word algebra comes from Arabic, as you can see from the al at the beginning, right, which means the in Arabic, so it's algebra. So that's not a coincidence, right? There's a lot of mathematical advances in the Islamic world. I'm not a historian of mathematics, but in related fields that are sort of quasi-mathematical, like optics, this is something I know a bit more about. You have people like Ibn al-Haytham who make big advances in theories of optics, based somehow on the Greek tradition, but also going well past it and changing the theories about what's actually going on. And of course, Ibn Sina would be another example. So Ibn Sina is this extremely innovative, creative philosopher, even though he's thinking about Aristotle all the time.
And then it spread to Toledo and the Al-Andalus, and then that's how it got to Europe.
Yeah, exactly. And in fact, when people think that philosophy ends in the 12th century in the Islamic world, this is why they think that. Because the Arabic Latin translation movement happened around the end of the 12th century. And so from a European perspective, philosophy in the Islamic world ends around 1200, because that's when they translated stuff. So anything that happened in the Islamic East after that was kind of invisible to the medievals, right? Because it was never translated. And as a result, scholars of Islamic history in Europe didn't really take it seriously until like the last 20, 30 years, when we started looking at stuff that wasn't translated into Latin. But there were translation movements in Spain, especially in Toledo, also in Sicily, so basically around the Mediterranean. They get a lot further with the Arabic philosophy translations, faster than they do with the Greek translations. And in fact, you might even argue that the translations of philosophy from Arabic, that's part of what provokes them to take a more serious interest in translating directly from Greek. So they have this encounter with Arabic science in Spain and Italy, and then they think, wow, this is really amazing, this is interesting, maybe we should go get our hands on Greek Aristotle, and then they go off to Byzantium, Constantinople, and get Greek manuscripts of Aristotle and Plato, and then they start translating that. So, for example, Thomas Aquinas, who's working in the second half of the 13th century, he's in the generation that's reading like hot off the presses translation of Aristotle from Greek instead of from Arabic.
Last question. Where does Islamic philosophy stand today?
Right, so obviously a lot has happened since what we've been talking about, because we only got as far as the 12th century or so. So, I mean, I'm an expert on that earlier period. I'm not an expert on modern day Islamic philosophy, but I do know that it's first of all very diverse and varied. I mean, the Islamic world is enormous and, you know, stretches from at least whatever, like Morocco to Malaysia, right, geographically. And so I think the first thing to say is that it would be a mistake to sort of assume that what's going on in philosophy in Egypt, let's say, is the same as what's going on in Iran or Pakistan or Malaysia. Second thing to say is that there is a surprising amount of continuity. So, for example, in Iran, there are religious seminaries where you can study philosophers who are fundamentally still within a line of philosophy that goes all the way back to Ibn Sina, via other philosophers like Mullah Sadra, who's an important early modern Muslim philosopher who lived in Iran during the Safavid period. And people are still thinking about Sadra's theories of existence, which are really responding to Ibn Sina's theory of existence. So in some ways, there's maybe more continuity in Islamic philosophy than there is in European philosophy. There's no break. This is actually the irony, is that people think, oh, it stopped at some point, but actually it stopped a lot less than it stopped here in Europe. But another feature is that, especially around, let's say, the turn of the 20th century, so you have the Ottoman Empire collapsing and then finally destroyed after World War I, and you have other examples of Europe apparently overtaking the Islamic world in terms of science, economics, military power, and so on. So a lot of thought was put into how this had happened and what to do about it. And there's a apparently kind of contradictory, but in fact complementary couple of developments. So one is that as often happened in other contexts where colonialism was relevant, you have people in Islamic countries thinking about what's going on in European philosophy and science and taking over ideas from, let's say, Marxism or positivism or existentialism. All of that stuff gets reflected in philosophy that was being written in Arabic in the Middle East in, let's say, the first half of the 20th century already. So there's that. But then on the other hand, there's also a kind of impulse to look back to what's called the tradition. So medieval philosophers even, like people drawing on Farabi as inspiration for their political philosophy, or on the historian Ibn Khaldun, who's very popular, or even Ibn Rushd, who's a commentator on Aristotle, who we haven't really talked about, sometimes called the Averroes. So there's a kind of oscillating dialectic between thinking, well, we need to take over the best ideas of Europe, and thinking, no, we need to take the best of our own ideas. And of course, what happens is you get this kind of negotiated settlements between the two things. So I think that's really characteristic of a lot of philosophy in the 20th century in the Islamic world, especially in the Maghreb, in the so-called Western Islamic world.
So each country or each region is having its own worldview, or the various, or even not, even within those places there.
Yeah, absolutely. Because there were huge. So, for example, in Egypt in the 20th century, there were huge debates between traditionalists, reformers, even different kinds of reformers. You know, so some reformers think, oh, what we need to do is use existentialism, and other reformers are saying, no, we need to use Al-Farabi, right? Or others saying, no, we need both, and we need to combine them somehow. And that's happening at the same time as you have like the founding of the Muslim Brotherhood. So it's a very complicated situation. I think actually, in some ways, there's a kind of Eurocentric tendency to assume that whereas European philosophy is very complicated, philosophy in other cultures must be quite simple. Like there's just Indian philosophy, and they all kind of think the same thing, like they're all monists or whatever, right? And Islamic philosophers, oh, they're all just really interested in existence or something. But actually, I mean, even if you get like very narrowly down to, let's say, just Egyptian philosophy in the 1920s, you'd see a lot of diversity there and people arguing with each other. So there's a lot to know about that as well.
That wasn't really my last question. My real last question, how did you meet Al-Kindi?
Oh, right. I got to Al-Kindi actually through that book I mentioned before, the Arabic translation of Plotinus. I was working on Greek philosophy and then I learned Arabic. So I wanted to understand how Greek philosophy was transmitted into Arabic. And the reason I got interested in Al-Kindi is that he's the guy who organized and corrected the translation of Plotinus. So he didn't translate it himself, but he was somehow overseeing the project of translating it. And so once I started working on the Arabic Plotinus, it was kind of natural to move on to Kindi as my next thing. So my first book was about the Arabic Plotinus, and my second book was about Al-Kindi.
Muslim Footprints is developed and produced by Kalima Communications in partnership with the Ismaili, the online platform for the global Ismaili community. This episode was filmed in Munich by Hasib Chagani and Zishan Damani. And here's the team at the Ismaili who helped put it together. Amira Jiwani is the series producer. Azim Lakhani is the editor, with assistance from Suraya Mirali for subtitling. Rasul Daya and Aleem Karmali have reviewed content and helped with promotion on the Ismaili website. Layla Sharif is our social media strategist, who's managing the Muslim Footprints social media accounts. And Alia Mohammed is supporting with promoting the series externally. Shahid Karim, who oversees the team at the Ismaili, is executive producer for the show, along with me. We're grateful to our external reviewers, who are all members of the board of the Institute of Ismaili Studies. These include Dr. Nadia Ibu Jamal, who lectures on the history of Muslim societies, Ali Asani, who is the Albertson Professor of Middle Eastern Studies and Professor of Indo-Muslim and Islamic Religion and Cultures at Harvard University, Arif Jamal, Associate Professor in the Faculty of Law at the National University of Singapore, and Dr. Fareed Panjwani, who is the Dean of the Institute for Educational Development at the Aga Khan University. Additional reviews were also provided by Dr. Alnur Danani, who specializes in the history of Islamic science, philosophy, and religious thought. And thank you all for watching. Be sure to follow our social media pages where you can find additional content and keep up to date with our news. My name is Aisha Daya, and you've been watching Muslim Footprints.